Hey, we're going to be jumping into our time in the Word. If you have your Bible with you, this is when you're going to want to get that out. We're going to jump in to see what God has for us. I'm going to pray, and we are going to go into it. Jesus, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to be your people, called and brought here today. I pray that you would open our eyes to your truth found in Scripture, God, that you would reveal yourself to us, God, that you would encourage us, that you would challenge us. Lord, to live lives worthy of the calling that you've placed on us, that we would be people who represent you well in this world, people who depend on you as our source of life, who trust you and only you for our forgiveness and our standing and our identity in this world, God. Would we, Lord, see you more clearly as we dig into your word tonight? In Jesus' name, amen. We're in a series right now called Living in Babylon. Last week, Dre kicked that off for us. We're looking in the beginning of this series. Last week, we started talking about a man named Daniel in the Old Testament and his three friends. Daniel and his friends, who we'll see later today as well, they were Israelites living in the land of Judah. Earlier in history, the northern kingdom of Israel had been conquered and pulled away. God allowed that to happen because time and time again, God's people would turn from him to worshiping the idols and the gods of the people around them. And God would warn them, and he would warn them, and he would send prophets. And then eventually he allowed them to be conquered. And then the same thing happened to the southern kingdom. Babylon came in and conquered them. And when Babylon came in, instead of just destroying everything, they took a large chunk of the population, the best of the best that they could find, and they took them back with them to their capital city. And so Daniel and his three friends, they're a part of this group that's been transported out. Almost all of the nation at that time got moved to other places, and Babylon moved other people into their home. It was a part of Babylon's way. Instead of just conquering a group of people long enough until they became strong enough to defend their homeland, instead you came in and you spread them out and you said, no, you aren't that anymore. You're a part of us. We're sending you into the different corners of our empire, and you're going to have to assimilate. You're going to have to absorb if you want to survive. And so that's what happens to Daniel and to his friends. It would be like for us if, without realizing it, China just swoops in and takes over the West Coast, and instead of leaving you at home where you are, instead of just living in LA still, except under Chinese rule, it's like they took you back and took you to different Chinese cities, and you had to learn the language and learn the culture in order to survive. You would have to fit in. That's what's happened to these exiles. That's what it is literally in the Old Testament. To be exiled is to be sent out from your home, to no longer be allowed to come back in. And so that's what's happened to the Jewish people as we get to this part of the story. We saw last week that Daniel and his friends, they chose to honor God, that they got put into this training program to become kind of administrators in the kingdom of Babylon because they had shown themselves to be young, to be smart, to be handsome, which Trey talked about as an ancient kind of clue. It's like if you looked good on the outside, you were probably good on the inside. And so they had picked them to be a part of this training program, and they had decided while they were in that program to take a stand for God, even though it probably would cost them their opportunities to move forward. It might cost them their opportunity to be in the program. It could even cost them potentially their life if they show themselves to be unwilling to follow the orders that are given to them. And instead, they choose to honor God, and God vindicates them, and he receives glory as a part of that process. For us as followers of Jesus, we haven't been ripped out of our physical home. We haven't been ripped out of the towns that we've grown in. Some of you might be living here and be away from home. You might be here because you came out to pursue a career in Hollywood, to be away for school, because your friends were out here, because the sunshine sounded better than wherever it was that you were living. And then a whole chunk of us here grew up in basically in Simi Valley, and we've never left, and we may never leave. For us, this idea of being exiled and being ripped out of home and living somewhere else with a totally different culture doesn't quite That's not something that we resonate with on the surface. So we talked about last week is that for us as followers of Jesus, because he's changed our identity, because we're now a part of the family of God, because we're part of God's people, that now we also find ourselves as exiles. We find ourselves on the outside, that we're a small remnant devoted to following God among a large group focused on following the gods of the day. Right? In our world, love, money, fame, self are the things that so many people around us are chasing, and yet if we're followers of Jesus, we've decided to make something else our priority. And that at times is going to put us at odds with everyone around us. So in this series, we're exploring the truth that as followers of Jesus, we can expect to feel like outsiders, and that Jesus' expectation was that we would stick out and not blend in. There are a couple things as we get ready to dive into our passage for today that I just want to highlight when it comes to this idea of being exiles. As we begin to understand this and absorb this into our own expectations for what our life should look like, there are a couple things I want to highlight. The first one is that first fill in there is that exiles are a God-fearing minority living surrounded by a pagan majority. That's what it was to be an Old Testament exile. You got pulled out of the nation of Israel, pulled away from the temple, pulled away from your community that you grew up with, and now you're amongst a bunch of people who worship all these other gods. And for the New Testament people of Jesus, we've been called out, we've been rescued, we've been redeemed and forgiven by the blood of Jesus. And now we are joining him on his rescue mission, holding out hope to a world that desperately needs it, but surrounded by a bunch of people who think that they have it all together. Exiles understand this. This is the next fill in there. Exiles understand that this is not my home. Ultimately, that's what it means to be an exile, is that this is not my home. I've grown up basically my whole life in Simi Valley. My family started coming to this church when I was in second grade. But Southern California is not my home. The United States is not my home. It's where I am right now. That my citizenship is with God in heaven. That who I am, where I'm from, is not from here. We see in Jeremiah 29:7, a part of what it means, how God is encouraging his people as they're being ready to be sent into exile. This is what it says in 29:7. It says, also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. That this isn't my home, but I'm not an undercover spy. I'm not a saboteur looking for a way to blow it all up. I'm not someone who's come in, sneaking in as an enemy to the people around me. Even though we disagree with the culture, we want the people to flourish and ultimately come to know God. To be in exile is to be a blessing to those around us. We see that Jesus' expectation would be for us to stick out. In John 17:16, he says, they, speaking about us, his followers, they are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Right? Jesus' expectation was that we wouldn't fit in. And he gets into that even more clearly a couple chapters before in John 15:19. He says, if you belong to the world, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you don't belong to the world. I've chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. And Jesus clarifies that the reason that at times the world will hate his people is because at the core, the world chose to hate Jesus. It was the world that we were a part of, that all of us have been rescued out of, that chose to hang Jesus up on the cross instead of listen to what it is he came to present. I think a large part of what shaped Jesus' expectations for what the lives of his followers would look like would be the book of Daniel. You can tell that Jesus is really familiar with the book of Daniel. Jesus' favorite nickname for himself that he pulls out comes out of the book of Daniel. When he refers to himself as the Son of Man, it comes out of a vision that Daniel has in chapter 8. of someone who looks like a son of man and goes to sit on God's throne with the Most High. And so Jesus uses that as a term for himself. And so Jesus has this idea of the book of Daniel, of exile, of, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, of what it looks like to follow God and choose him even under threat of death, and God showing up in the middle of that all of that is kind of bubbling in the background of Jesus' expectations for his people. And so today we're going to look more at what it means and what it looks like to be an outsider surrounded by a kingdom of people who don't see the world the way that we do, who aren't on the same page, and to see, okay, what does it look like to be a follower of God, someone who represents him well amongst a group of people who have more power than us, more say, and then aren't wanting to live in a way to serve and follow God. And so we're going to be looking in Daniel chapter 2. What's up, Kellyanne? Nice to see you. Thanks for popping in. How did the kids' event go? Good? Great. Awesome. I'm doing what you didn't do when I went and snuck in the back of yours. Daniel chapter 2. We're going to be reading all of Daniel chapter 2 together today. It's a narrative. It's a story. If you're familiar with some of the stories in the book of Daniel, there are certain ones that we tell regularly, oftentimes in kids ministry. Daniel chapter 1 sometimes gets mentioned because it's easy enough to talk to kids about, like, hey, you guys ever seen a vegetarian? Daniel sort of was one for a little while. And we're familiar with Daniel chapter 3, which is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego getting thrown in the fiery furnace. Spoilers for maybe possibly next week. We'll see. And then we're familiar with Daniel in the lion's den, because that's like a really, you can do it. You can bring out the stuffy lion and be like, hey, look, it's a lion, but God did the thing. This chapter is one that almost always gets glossed over, because this one gets a little weird. We get to talk about some interesting sidebar stuff today. There is a chart that's going to be coming up later to explain a little bit of what's going on. This is an interesting chapter, but you're going to have to hang through and try to hold on to the threads of where the story is going. As best as you can, imagine yourself in the shoes with Daniel. If this was you, how would you feel as a part of this? At this point in the story, Daniel and his friends have made it through their training program, and they are a part of the advisors and wise men to the king of Babylon. It's a huge group of people, most of whom are pagans, practice sorcery, practice divination, and then, the Babylonians, they throw in hey, here are these guys who serve this god Yahweh from this other area that we conquered. We're going to throw them in here too in case they have something wise to offer. And so at this point, Daniel and his friends are a part of this group. And so we're going to jump in. So starting in verse 1, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he couldn't sleep. Have you ever had a dream that you woke up from, and it just was unsettling? Whatever it was that happened, whatever, and sometimes you can remember it, and sometimes you can't, but just one of my favorite things is to wake up in the middle of the night, roll over, and go back to sleep. I think even more than sleeping, I love falling asleep. But then you have those times where you just wake up, it's 2 a.m, and you're just like, I don't think I'll ever sleep again. That's what the king is going through. He's had a dream. It has stuck out. It's not just any dream. It's something that has deeply disturbed him. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. The people that he depended on who would go and inquire of the pagan gods and the demonic influences behind them, and he's asking them for their insight. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. The astrologers asked the king, May the king live forever. Answered the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll interpret it. I almost imagine them dancing up with little bells and whistles. I don't know why. I've watched too many movies. The king replied to the astrologers, This is what I have firmly decided. If you don't tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. It's a little bit more than you'll be fired. He's like, hey, for whatever reason, this dream has troubled him and disturbed him. I don't know if he has been suspicious that they're lying to him or something about this dream cued him into it. But he's like, if I just tell them what it is, they're going to tell me what I want to hear. I don't want to hear what I want to hear. I want to know the truth. If you want to interpret this, you have to tell me what it was. If you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and then we'll interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you're trying to gain time because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing from any magician or enchanter or astrologer." They're like, "What are you talking about? We were not there. We don't know what your dream was. We did not dream it also. What are you asking from us? This is not in our power to do. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans." There was this ancient idea that when it came to dreams, that to understand your dreams, it was information coming from the outside, from like the spirit realm into your dreams, and that was giving you the information. That was like a well-believed thing in the ancient world, that when you had a dream and you didn't understand it and it seemed particularly like something that stood out, it was information from outside coming from you. If you think about today, when you have a weird dream, when you think about something weird, you have a dream about your best friend is driving a new car and then they go off a cliff and then all of a sudden you're in a McDonald's and you get food poisoning from eating a plate of sushi, and you wake up and you're like, "What does that mean about me? What have I?" Right? When we have a weird dream, we start asking like, "What is it I think about my best friend?" Or "What is it they said to me?" Or "Is this?" And we start trying to interpret. Oftentimes we interpret our dreams based on our internal knowledge. We think our dreams are revealing something about us, whereas ancients would have thought that dreams were revealing some truth about the outside world. You can kind of even get a little bit of a picture of, for different cultures, where the important sources of truth are based on where they think dreams are pointing them. In their culture, they thought important sources of truth were held in the spirit realm. For us, we think the most important truths oftentimes are held within us, and somehow dreams are always looked to as like the key to unlock this. And so these people, they're used to interpreting dreams. They're used to giving meaning to things. They're used to having influence from the spirit realm to be able to do those things to some degree of efficacy. But when it comes to actually reading the king's mind and being able to know exactly what the dream is, they're at a loss. They can't do it. Verse 12, "This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon." He's a balanced guy. "So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and with tact. He asked the king's offer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. Imagine someone comes to the door and they're like, "Sorry, Daniel. Sorry, this is it. If you could come out to the yard, we've got the gallows set up for you. It's over. You want the hanging? You want the spike where you like sit there and you die after a couple days? You want just the good old fashioned headlock? What's it going to be?" And Daniel's like, he responds. He thinks. He's present in the moment. He has this wisdom, and he's like, "Hey, Arioch, what's up with the king? Like, what? It was unexpected on this Tuesday afternoon." He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? And Arioch explained the matter. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel, right, interesting, right? The king accuses the other wise men of trying to buy more time by being sneaky. Daniel just goes in and he just asks, like, "Hey, can I have some time? Can you give me some time so I can interpret this?" Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who most of us know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but that's the next chapter. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, right, so he goes to his friends. He's like, guys, we've got to pray. We have got to pray. Daniel doesn't come in with the knowledge. Daniel doesn't come in. He's just like, I got this for you, king. He's wise, but he's not that wise. And so they go before God, the only real source of knowledge. And they're asking, God, would you please reveal this to us? During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven, and he said, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells in him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power, and you have made known to me what we asked of you, and you have made known to us the dream of the king. Right? And so Daniel and his friends, they just stop and they worship because God has shown up when they went to him pleading for an answer to the king's question to save their lives. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, don't execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I've found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. The king asked Daniel, who was also called Belteshazzar, are you able to, I love how it just like reminds us. It was in the first chapter also. Each of the exiles got a new name as a part of their reprogramming that happened. But I love that the author's just like, in case you forgot his name, here it is one more time. Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown the king Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in the bed are these. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, to the future, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know that the interpretation, and that you may understand what went through your mind. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. You can see some of the inspiration for Nebuchadnezzar's future acts in the next chapter. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. Tiny, tiny pieces that blow away in the wind. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings, right? A title that means like you're top dog. Like you rule the nation that rules all other nations. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Language that's a little bit shades of Genesis, but we can't be here all night. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. For iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Of all four of those metals, iron is the strongest of them. Gold, most valuable. Iron holds together the most. Just as you saw, the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron. So this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed in with the clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw, the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate, that's down on his face, before Daniel, and paid him honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods, and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all the wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. And so this is the story. That's Daniel chapter 2. In its entirety. Some of the things that are in there are maybe a little bit relatable. Some of the things feel like kind of wild. And so I want to kind of break through a couple things that stand out. We're going to take a quick sidebar at one point to explore the statue, although there is a little bit of a sidebar to the main point of the passage. The first thing that I want to highlight is that Daniel and his friends, when they were forced to confront this crisis, when they were faced with death, when everything was coming down around them, Daniel and his friends responded with prayer. There was a crisis in front of them. Someone showed up, and they're like, "Hey, your execution date is here." And Daniel's like, let me see if I can get a day's worth of time. Like, "Hey, can I have an extension on that project real quick?" And then so they show up, and they get on their knees, and they spend time in prayer. It could have gone different. They could have decided, this whole Babylon thing is stupid. Let's try to run. I don't know how possible that would have been for them. I don't know how much they were under guard. Obviously, there was this death sentence above them. Maybe they couldn't even run at all. They could have decided, hey, you know what? This is life or death. We're fighting it out. You know what? We tried to do it the peaceful way. We did the vegetarian thing. This time we fight to war, right? And they could have maybe taken a couple of Babylonian guards with them, but they're wise men, not like warriors. Who even knows what would happen? They could have tried to ignore the threat. They could have been like, you know what? Maybe the king ate something. We'll let him sleep it off. And maybe he'll wake up in the morning and realize that killing all of the wise men is pretty dumb, and maybe we'll end up fine. Instead, they chose to go before the one true God and ask him for wisdom and insight. And then also, I want to point out that they had to wait on God as a part of that. They didn't go to God and get an instant download of like, hey, here's the answer. Right? God allowed it not to just be Daniel, for Daniel to rope in his friends, and for them to go and to plead. And God allowed the amount of time that they were going before him to reflect how serious the need was. And I think a lot of times God does that because in that process, he's also drawing out our heart. That if all it ever took was a quick 2-second conversation with God to get anything done, how much would actually get done in our hearts? And so he allows them to feel the seriousness of the situation. And as a result, when he shows up and offers Daniel the vision that explains everything, it results in worship. Right? They go and before God and they praise him and they glorify him for being the one who is the holder of wisdom and the holder of these mysteries that he had revealed to them. For us, as exiles in our world, right, we have access to a power greater than anything else anyone else has access to. Whether it's a source of wisdom, whether it's a source of being able to do things in our life that no one else can, whether it's a place to go for comfort, that we have access to the God of God, the one who rules over everything. That we have access to go to him whenever there is a crisis presented before us. And yet when we face problems, how often do I choose to fight things like the world? To be like, okay, well, what would the wise thing to be do right now? What's the thing that makes sense to me? Okay, how am I going to do this under my own power? Or how often do we decide to try to tune it out and focus on other things instead of doing that, or try to figure it out under our own power? How often do we not take advantage of this amazing gift that we have to go before the Lord in prayer? The book of Hebrews talks about how in Jesus, that because he has forgiven us, because he's washed us by his blood, because we are made right before him, and all of our evil and all of our sin has been covered by him, that we can go before God's throne with confidence. That we can walk in knowing that we are a loved son or daughter in his presence, and we can bring what we have going to him and hand it to him and ask him to do with it what is good and wise. Even if it's different than how we would want to handle it, we can hand it to him to deal with. How often do we take advantage of that? How often do we choose to be people to go before him? Right? To be an exile means to recognize that how everyone else handles their problems isn't how I need to handle mine. That I have access to a greater power than what everyone else does. Second fill-in is that Daniel, what I want to highlight is that Daniel didn't sugarcoat the truth. Daniel was given a ridiculous message to take to this unbalanced king. This is a guy who's just willing to kill all of his advisors because they can't tell him his dream. Ignore the fact that, when we know the story, God shows up and a whole thing going. This is a guy who, is not stable. A couple chapters later, God's going to allow him to go literally mad, and he'll be out eating grass in the field because God lets him go. He's just not a stable, dependable person. God gives Daniel the message, hey, tell the king, yeah, he's a part of this statue. I'm knocking it over. That's not a comfy message, right? That's not a message. He did throw in a little bit you know what, king? You're the head of gold. Gold's pretty good. Next kingdom of silver, not as good as your kingdom. But it's still this message of hey, everything that you're building it's not worth anything. It's not going to last. All of this kingdom business that you're doing, Babylon is going to be tossed like chaff in the wind. What you've devoted your life to, the memory people have of you, all of that is for nothing. God's going to wipe it out. That's a tough message to bring to a crazy king. The king may have promised, yeah, tell me your dream and I'll reward you. Who even knows with this guy? And yet Daniel comes in and he delivers the message, and he delivers it faithfully. He's committed to God and God alone. God gives him the truth, and he comes and he brings it. And the king recognizes this greater wisdom. The king was looking for an answer. The king was concerned that the other people would just flatter him and butter him up. The king wanted the truth. And he resonated with it, and he worshiped God, although not enough to give his life over and serve Yahweh with his whole self. He recognizes God in that moment, and he offers up worship. As exiles in a broken and fallen world, we carry God's truth with us. And there are going to be times where we recognize that God's truth is not always comfortable. That a part of the amazing message that God forgives us is the uncomfortable truth that we need to be forgiven. That we live in a world that tries to whitewash over all of the grossness in our own life and look and point at the evil in other people's lives, and doesn't want to always reckon with the fact that I am a part of the problem, not just someone who suffers in a world that's broken. And so sometimes, as carriers of that message, we want to hold that part back because we're afraid of how that might cause a reaction in someone else. But there will be times when God opens the door. It might even be this next week for you. It could be in a conversation with a friend. It could be with a coworker at work. It could be after class talking to a professor, where God opens up a window and you can tell, here's this moment where I can stand by what is true, or I can choose to keep my mouth shut. because the truth might be uncomfortable. But what we see is that oftentimes God's truth still resonates with us. How many of us are sitting here because someone shared that truth with us and we weren't afraid of what we already deep down knew, that there is something wrong, not just in this world, but also in me, and I need someone who can address that. And Jesus is the answer for that. Jesus is the hope. But people who don't even know what the problem is are going to have trouble holding on to that hope. We have to be people, if we want to bring a solution to a broken and hurting world, we have to be people who aren't afraid of what is true. Instead, we're not shoving the truth down people's throats. We're not hiding it and never bringing it out. And when God opens the right opportunities, that we courageously trust him with that, we share the truth and let the consequences be what the consequences will be. And we'll see that time and again with Daniel and his friends. They will stand by God, they will obey him, and then trust him with the outcome. And in this book, God will show up over and over and over again with that. All right, now I want to talk for a moment about this statue that Daniel kind of breaks down, that the king had a dream about. This is, I think, the most fascinating thing in this chapter, the thing that people most often want to know, like, what is going on here? Like, what is this about? And there's some cool stuff here, and we're also going to talk about what we maybe don't really quite know. I do want to mention, this is a sidebar. This isn't the main point of the passage, and we'll get back to that idea in just a second. But I think we have something to bring up on the screen. Yes, look. It's a statue. And so the gold head at the top represents the Babylonian kingdom. This is super clear from it, right? He's addressing Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is leading that kingdom. In just a couple of, a matter of years, Nebuchadnezzar will be presented with an opportunity to humble himself before God, and he does. His son in the next chapter will be presented with an opportunity to humble himself before God, and he doesn't. And God allows him to be assassinated, which ushers in the next kingdom, which is the Medo-Persian kingdom. That's represented by that silver chest. Both of those two kingdoms, that's clear that that's what's supposed to represent in the book as you're reading through the book. That is whoever authored this book, whatever was going on, it's super clear that they would have understood that. Looking through history, the next two big world kingdoms, the belly and the thighs of bronze, that's the Greek kingdom, right? So Alexander the Great comes in. He conquers a huge swath of what at that point what they would have thought of as the known world. He conquers all of that. The iron legs are the Roman kingdom. All right, they're the next up. They are incredibly strong. The description of iron that Daniel gives to them would have been super accurate. The Roman kingdom, their empire spread because they were so good at warfare. They knew what they were doing. They had invented brand new ways of fighting, brand new equipment to use, and they were incredibly effective. And then they used roads to tie the whole empire together. It was a modern, or it was a marvel at the time. Not a modern marvel because now is modern and they are not. That kingdom has that's passed away. That's not around anymore. And then we get to the feet that are mixed iron and clay. We don't know. There are lots of different answers to this, and there are two specific types of answers that I kind of want to break down just so that you guys can have a little picture of it. If this was last night and I was in high school, I would just be mostly glossing over this stuff, but I think it's kind of interesting when we have a little bit extra time in here to kind of unpack together. There are kind of two answers for this, right? Because you have this rock that comes that represents God's kingdom. This rock comes down and just blows up this statue. And so the question is, this kingdom, this rock kingdom, is this something that God sets up and represents when Jesus first came and died and rose from the dead, and it's his kingdom reigning in the hearts of believers? Because if that's so, then whatever the clay and iron mixture was, that would be really represented by the Roman Empire at that time. And it's just kind of a further extension of the Roman Empire, this description that it was brittle and it was kind of not held together that well, and it wouldn't really exist anymore. And so there's a whole group of people who would understand the existence of God's kingdom, kind of his reign, as like something that happened right then. Their viewpoint on end times stuff would be what would be considered an amillennial viewpoint. If you want to go Google that later for your own enjoyment. I would be up here for a long time if I started unpacking all of that. A whole nother group of people, premillennial, who have a premillennial outlook on things, would say, no, that doesn't represent Christ's first coming. That's when Jesus comes back the second time and sets up a reigning kingdom on the earth. And so people in that camp would say, no, the iron and clay feet either represents like everything after the Roman Empire or represents a future thing that will exist one day. I was watching an old message from 1993 from a famous preacher talking through this passage, and it's like 1993, right? And so he's like, if you look over in Europe, they're starting to bring together some nations over there and trying to figure out how to like have a unified like group of everyone. Curiously, they're 10 toes and it's 10 nations, and but right now they're trying to figure out how to have a common currency, and that just may never come to pass. You never know. And meanwhile, I'm sitting here, I'm like, it's the euro. Like, they figured that out a long time ago. The truth is that with prophecy and stuff like this, a lot of times, if you're trying to look forward, Christians at all different time periods will be able to say, like, well, this kind of looks like what's going on right now. This kind of looks like this thing, right? Because he's like, oh, it's Europe, and that's where Rome used to be, and so that's kind of, but this whole vision was not given to the king to answer the question of who is the pinky toe, which nation is the big toe on the right foot, when exactly is the era of the clay and the iron. A lot of times we can zoom in too much into a passage and try to make it answer questions it's not trying to give us. Instead, this passage is given to King Nebuchadnezzar, and as a result, to all the exiles under Daniel and the people who would read the book later, it's given with a very clear message. The main message that comes out of that is your next fill-in, is that God's kingdom crushes all competition. God's kingdom crushes all competition. Sometimes we jump into passages like this and we start looking for, like, hey, where am I in this passage? Am I Daniel? Does God want to interpret dreams through me? And while, like, I think that's something that God is capable of doing, I don't think the interpretation of dreams is something that Daniel 2 is saying, like, hey, this is for everybody to be able to figure out. Like, his three friends, they don't get to interpret a dream in the passage. It's just Daniel, and it's for a very unique time period that happens. And so if we jump in and we start trying to insert ourselves into the story and be like, am I this person? Or it's like, am I Nebuchadnezzar? Is God going to speak to me through a dream? And we start jumping into things really quickly, looking for where am I in the passage? But many times, if we want to understand God's word, the best thing that we can do is stop and ask the question, what does this say about God? Because more often than not, what God's word is revealing, more than it's revealing who I am, more than it's revealing even what I should do, it's revealing this is who God is. And so God is encouraging his people and challenging Nebuchadnezzar to humility by saying, I am the God of gods, and I crush all competition. Doesn't matter if it's kingdom of gold, silver, bronze, iron, it's all clay. It all turns to chaff. It all blows away. And so whether you see that as Jesus coming and setting up his rule in our life now, right, and you can see the impact that's had worldwide, the way that's changed, like the way that Christianity has changed the world in 2,000 years between education and orphanages and hospitals, things that are blessings to the world that never even existed, the way that people of all sorts of tongues and languages have come around to serve the God that was only really known in this small area of the world for so much of human history. Like there have been massive changes that have happened, or whether you understand it as this is the promise that Jesus is going to come and he's going to set up a kingdom that truly reigns physically on the earth. The message is clear either way, that God's kingdom can't be stopped. As exiles, it's important to remember that we're on the side that wins in the end. When you're not at home, when you feel like an outsider, when you feel like everyone else is pushing in against you, when it feels like the world is changing around you, when you have maybe older adults telling you like, oh man, back in my day, in the 60s, in the 80s, in the 2000s, and whatever, it was better. There were more Christians. It was better for us. It was easier. Things were simpler, and it feels like you're losing. No, like in the end, Jesus wins. I don't need to be anxious about what's happening in the world right now, which way the wind is blowing. I don't need to feel like who's in the White House or who's in like world power in other nations, that those are the things that have the most consequence to me. These kingdoms will rise and they will fall. And then I may be someone who sets up, like is called to have influence in one way or another in the world, but ultimately the kingdoms of this world will come and they'll go, and they'll blow away like the wind, but God's kingdom lasts forever. And it frees us up for our true mission, not to be smug about winning, right? Not to be people who are like, well, you don't really know, but I'm gonna be fine. Jesus is bigger than you. Where we start like looking down on other people because they haven't figured out who Jesus is yet. And it's not to treat our enemy as neighbors who are on the losing side. It's not to treat the people around us who are our neighbors as enemies that we're contending with. The Bible is really clear that we're not fighting against flesh and blood, that Jesus came to rescue humanity. And we are now joining him in that mission, that we are ambassadors for Jesus, people who are away from our homeland, but who are representing our King, holding out the hope of a Savior that came and demonstrated the lengths that God's love was willing to go to. That Jesus was willing to die in the place of rebels against the crown, of wicked sinners, and to die for us and to change us into people who are able to represent him well. That he was strong enough to rise from the dead, doing the impossible, beating back death, and that one day he'll return, wipe every tear away, and reign forever with us as his people, having wiped all evil out. And each of us is blessed to have had an opportunity to move from the side of darkness into the side of light, and now we offer that opportunity to others. And we can do that with confidence because we know God's kingdom wins. It's not about being cocky, and it's not about deciding like, well, great, I don't have to worry about what's going on in the world. But it gives us the ability to move with strength into any circumstance, whether it's today in Southern California, surrounded by people who don't think the way that we do, whether it's a house church in China that has to meet quietly because their government is willing to persecute them, wherever you are in the world, as a believer in Jesus, you can know it doesn't matter who's in power because Jesus wins in the end. I want to give you 3 things to consider as the band comes up and as we get ready to close out in a song of worship. 3 things to maybe think about as we look to take the wisdom that's offered to us in the book of Daniel and apply it to our own lives as modern day exiles. The first is who's in your prayer community? Daniel knew who to go to when he needed help praying. Daniel knew this is a big deal. This affects a lot of people. I'm going to my 3 friends, who I affectionately in my mind refer to as Shadrach and Benny because I watched a lot of VeggieTales at one point in my life. He knew who to go to because you can tell they have prayed together before. Right? They weren't exiles who were just alone. They had each other. Who are the other believers in your life that you go to, that you pray with often enough that when the crisis happens, they're going to be there for you and pick up and pray there alongside with you? This is why being in a life group is a great practice to be in, because you don't know when the crisis is going to come. You don't know when you're going to need other believers around you. You don't know when you're going to be called on to be that person for someone else. But being in a community of people who talk regularly and openly about the things going on in their life, who lift up these concerns regularly before God, it prepares us for when the crisis really comes. Secondly, how boldly do you speak the truth? Do you ever find yourself biting your tongue, holding back on saying what you know is true in a moment? And the Bible is really clear that we're supposed to represent Jesus in grace and truth, right? We're not supposed to walk around just cocky people who are just slamming people with truth statements. But we certainly can't represent Jesus well by living a life that hides and shies away from what is true. And so do the people that you work with, the people who know you, do your acquaintances know how important Jesus is to you? Do you stick out enough to meet Jesus' expectation that you're not going to feel at home in the world? Or do you work really hard to have church you be when you're with your church people? And then you have work you and family you to try to fit into every situation as perfectly as you can? How boldly are you willing to speak what is true about Jesus and the God that he has come to reconcile us to? And then lastly, where is your hope? Where is your hope? Is your hope rooted in the truth that Jesus wins in the end? Can you claim that statement, this is not my home? That, you know what, if this life doesn't turn out, if the American dream is not available to me, if this life doesn't turn out the way that I wanted, if I don't get to have the retirement that I had planned, the job that I had planned, go to the college I wanted to go to, have get married the year that I wanted and have the 3 kids, and whatever the plan is that you look at, whatever life is supposed to be, can you say, you know what, I would still love that, but you know what, this is not what it's about. This is not my home. This is not the kingdom I'm investing in. Or is your hope in a certain outcome, a certain future, a certain type of job? What is it that holds your hope? Because as exiles, people who recognize that this life is not the end of the story, we have access to a greater hope in Jesus that is a sure thing, that he will set up a kingdom that will never end, that we get to be a part of. Would you guys stand with me as we go into this last song of worship? Jesus, you are our King. You are the one that we worship. You are the one who we look to as our hope and for our salvation. I pray, God, that you would teach us what it looks like to be people who are in this world, invested in the lives of people, but aren't of this world, that stand out, that stick out. And God, would we do that in a way that holds out hope to a world around us that in the darkness doesn't know what to hope in, that is constantly depending on people and circumstances that will fail them. Jesus, would we be able to be examples that point people back to you? Would more people fall in love with you because of what you're doing in our life, because of our commitment to your truth and our willingness to live out your grace that you've shown us? And would more people turn to you and find themselves as a part of that family, as a part of this small, surrounded minority who is serving and loving the God of heaven? We ask this in your name and for your glory. Amen.